Ladies and gentlemen, we live in a complex and pivotal time in which the world faces a spectrum of challenges to its peace and its prosperity and its stability. Last year, I was invited, along with 10 other former senior American government officials, to meet privately with Prime Minister Maliki during his visit to Washington. This was among the most discouraging meetings I have ever attended. Prime Minister treated us to a 30-minute presentation on his vision for Iraq's foreign policy, the essence of which was to declare Iraq's so-called neutrality in regional and international affairs. He told us, and it's almost a direct quote, "We want to live and let live. We don't interfere in other countries' affairs, and they should not interfere in ours," unquote. But today, given Iraq's overt support for Assad and more than cozy relationship with Iran's rulers, two of the world's most illegal and brutal regimes, such a patently ludicrous claim was beyond cynical. Frankly, given the enormous sacrifice over the past decade of this country and others to Iraqi's freedom, it was insulting. As far back as 2009, knowledgeable leaders in the Middle East warned about the likelihood that Prime Minister Maliki had Iranian tendencies and they would take Iraq down the wrong path. And sadly, they appear to be right thus far, despite our best efforts to the contrary. During his recent trip to the region, Secretary Kerry correctly expressed the concern that Iraq is, quote, just dragging us along in a full range of areas. But perhaps the most notable example of where we diverge with Iraq applies to the principal reason we gather here today, and that is what appears to be a global reluctance to offend the Prime Minister's government's complicity with regard to a growing human rights debacle in Iraq. And so it's time for candor, and it's a time to separate fact from fiction with regard to the refugees of Camp Ashraf and Camp Liberty. People we promise to protect, people who are entitled to justice, continue to languish in deplorable conditions. They remain homeless, stripped of their rights, living in confinement, under constant threat of attack and murder, and mainly because they hope for a better future for their native country next door. And despite America's pledges, Iraq's promises, and the international community's obligation to protect this unarmed group of refugees, an unconscionable humanitarian crisis grinds on while the world responds with stunning indifference. I think it would be instructive if perhaps we reviewed how we got to where we are today to understand clearly the facts and then highlight what must be done to right this shameful injustice. In 2008, the United States and the government of Iraq concluded a status of forces agreement. Upon the withdrawal of U.S. forces in 2009, the responsibility to protect the refugees of Camp Ashraf reverted to Iraq, a responsibility the Maliki government pledged to fulfill. What has happened since the handover? Here are the facts. Fact: the refugees have been repeatedly subjected to psychological and physical harassment, violence, and the threats of violence, both by Iraqi authorities and Iranian provocateurs. Fact: on October 17, 2010, the Iraqi military launched an unprovoked attack on the camp, unarmed camp, killing 11, injuring 500. The raid occurred while the U.S. Secretary of Defense was visiting Baghdad, and what was sure to be an ironic insult conjured up by Iraqi leaders to further please the Iranian regime. Fact: on April 3, 2011, on the eve of a visit by Prime Minister Maliki to Tehran, Iraq security forces entered Camp Ashraf with armored personnel carriers and other military vehicles, equipment probably provided by the United States. Again, completely unprovoked, the Iraqi military took up their positions around the camp, began its assault, killing 36 unarmed residents and injuring 345. Fact: last year, the Iraqi government announced the closure of Camp Ashraf. The Iraqi government's insistence on the move was accompanied by its assurance, and ours, and those of the United Nations, to the residents that their removal to the former Camp Liberty outside of Baghdad would be carefully executed, that the camp would be prepared to receive them in safe, sanitary, and proper condition. from where the refugees would be resettled to third world countries in a swift and orderly fashion. Fact, the international community has failed. The 3,100 residents of the ironically named Camp Liberty, a facility renamed Camp Huria, but one which could be more aptly named Camp Shame, all continue to live in poor and oppressive conditions, deprived of proper medical care and legal rights. The facility at Camp Huria has become more of a prison than a camp. Fact, promise that the refugees' relocation to Camp Huria would be followed by swift third country resettlement has thus far proved to be another fiction. Since the transfer from Ashraf to Liberty, more people have perished than have been transferred abroad. In fact, 9 refugees have perished and 100 have been injured, with only 7 being resettled out of the country. Fact. Most recently, just a few weeks ago, Camp Huria, and remember, we're talking about a refugee camp, under the observation and auspices of the United Nations, was rocketed. I was informed that neither our ambassador to Iraq nor the UN Special Representative for Iraq, Mr. Martin Kobler, have visited the camp since the attacks because they've been advised that conditions are too dangerous, which makes the point precisely. In the 4 weeks since the attack, the Iraqi government has still not returned the bodies of those killed in the most recent attack. Each day that passes brings with it the threat of more rockets, additional raids, and an increased death toll. A group that is feared and despised by the Iranian leadership and mistreated by the government of Iraq, all because they espouse the desire of a modern, democratic, nuclear-free Iran that is at peace with its neighbors. Something is terribly wrong with this picture. Reminds me of the words of Edmund Burke that has so often inspired America's role in the world. And I quote, "All that is necessary for the triumph of evil is for good people to do nothing," unquote. Over 3.5 years ago, a beautiful 18-year-old Iranian woman named Neda Agha Soltan, an aspiring musician and photographer, was standing in the streets of Tehran. Accompanied by her music teachers, she was viewing a massive protest against the regime's fraudulent presidential elections. Though guilty of no crime, unarmed, and posing no danger except for her ideals, she was targeted by a sniper posing from a nearby rooftop. I don't know what became of her murderer, but I will bet this. History will show that Neda and the cell phone messages, the electronic images, and the internet posts which shared her dreams and told her story will prove to be far more powerful than the assassins and the guns that tried to silence her hopes. And that's the future that we are entering, the future that should serve as a warning to the Iranian regime, to the regime's so-called leaders. We say, your days are numbered, not because of the condemnation and resolve of the international community that will insist on your compliance with international law. They are numbered because your people will not cease in their demand for a government that reflects their hopes and their aspirations. The fulfillment of these hopes and aspirations rests on the establishment of a united, principled, courageous, and organized civic opposition, one that can touch people's hearts and minds, one that can harness their passion and convictions to ensure not only that spring returns to Iran, but the spring blossoms into an enduring season of peace and prosperity. The global stability on which America's security and prosperity depends cannot be achieved without an America that meets its obligations, lives its values, and keeps its word. If we don't, then who will? We can do this, we must do this, and I believe we will do this. Thank you.